Elliot Colburn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mrs McVeigh, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered waste incineration and recycling, and it's a pleasure to see many familiar faces in today's debate. Mrs McVeigh, I think this is the third time we've debated incineration in this chamber since the elections, and it was a pleasure to attend them both. And indeed, it's great to see the Minister in her place, who I know has been on the receiving end of my many frustrations when it comes to this topic, both here in the main chamber and in the many conversations we've had offline. So I'm very grateful for her being here to respond yet again to a debate on this topic. The Minister and indeed this House will know full well my frustrations with the incinerator in Beddington, in my Carshalton and Wallington constituency. Indeed, next to the additional £500 million for my local hospital and to build a new local hospital, this is one of the topics I speak about most in this House. So I won't revisit many of the arguments that I know the Minister and many of my colleagues here with me today will already have heard in past debates. But I do want to address some developments with my local incinerator that I've not yet had the chance to raise in this House, before going on to discuss the impact of incineration on recycling rates. The Minister will know the concerns I have raised with her in the past about emissions breaches of incinerators, the need for independently run air quality monitoring stations near these sites, rather than leaving them to be self-reporting by the operator, the need to focus on the circular economy, reducing the amount of waste we produce in the first place, and indeed the all-important knock-on effect of operating incinerators such as traffic movements in the surrounding area. Carshalton and Wallington residents, I think it's fair to say, were promised quite a lot when the Lib Dems approved the building of an incinerator in Beddington. They were promised things like the Beddington farmlands, which is now several years overdue. They were promised things like new wildlife habitats to rebuild rare species, only for the water levels surrounding ground nesting birds for protection were allowed to drop and predators attack and destroy their nests last year. They were promised things like robust reporting on carbon, only for there to be, by my calculation, 184 incidences where they exceeded the 150 meg carbon monoxide limits and 733 invalid carbon monoxide reports in 2020 alone. They were promised things like a stronger local road network to cope with the traffic, only for residents on Beddington Lane to constantly face problems with their traffic and air pollution and much more besides. It's no surprise, therefore, Mrs McVeigh, that residents feel let down and even angry that the concerns they continue to raise continue to be brushed aside and not acted upon. But there have been new developments at Beddington which have caused alarm, and the one I want to focus on today is the new South London Waste Plan. This plan is supposed to bring together the lead members from 4 councils in South London, Sutton, Kingston, Croydon and Merton, and ultimately decide a strategy on how to deal with their waste. And in short, Mrs McVeigh, the strategy is to make Sutton, particularly Beddington Lane, the dumping ground of South London. Under the plan, Sutton will ambitiously take over 700,000 tonnes of waste from these 4 boroughs. That's over half of all the waste that these 4 boroughs produce. Croydon is taking about 19%, Merton is taking about 26%, but the real winners here are Lib Dem-run Kingston Council, who are taking a measly 2.6% of all waste produced across 4 London boroughs. To add an insult to injury, Beddington is also increasing its maximum capacity by around 45,000 tonnes, to take it to 347,422 tonnes of waste per year. Together with the waste plan, the increase in Beddington's maximum capacity, and indeed the approval of a new sewage site in Beddington Lane, this means that around 1 million tonnes of waste a year is projected to be sent here. To put that into perspective, as that's quite a large number, that's around 500 heavy good vehicle movements a day just for waste, let alone all the other industrial sites that require heavy good vehicles in Beddington. And even the applicants during the planning committee for the sewage plan inferred that this could equate to a vehicle movement every 3 minutes. The uplift in the maximum capacity at Beddington was approved by the Environment Agency on the 9th of December, and I would urge them to reconsider granting this uplift. However, it's baffling to me that the South London Waste Partnership, which oversaw the plan, then went on to meet over a week later from this decision being taken on the 17th of December and suddenly decided that it wasn't entirely happy with the increase in Beddington's capacity. Mrs McVeigh, I'm slightly confused as to why they didn't know that the decision had been taken over a week beforehand, and what the point of this partnership is if the lead councillors from these 4 boroughs have no control or influence over decisions of this nature. But Mrs McVeigh, to many residents, this appears nothing more than a convenient distraction to allow the Lib Dems to pursue what they can only imply is their ambition to make Sutton the dumping ground of South London and give their mates in Kingston a hand at the expense of roads and air pollution in Sutton. I had hoped that we might get answers to these questions last night, where the Conservative group on Sutton Council brought a motion to our full council stating their opposition to the increase and asking that Sutton gets a fair share. However, during what I can only call a childish, well, let's call it a debate, the Lib Dems reverted back to their usual diktat when it comes to the incinerator. Nothing to see here, not me, Gov, we're ambitious about our waste plans here, mate. They then proceeded to vote for an amendment which removed the very line that called for Sutton to get a fair share. Just let that sink in for a bit. The Lib Dems essentially voted against Sutton having a fair deal when it comes to waste management. That is disgraceful. The Bennington farmlands have been delayed, wildlife habitats have been attacked, air quality monitoring is negligent, roads are unable to cope, and now we have a projected almost 1 million tonnes of rubbish making its way to Sutton, much of it to be burnt. Mrs McVeigh, under any measurement, this is a bad deal for Bennington, for Hackbridge, and indeed for Carshalton and Wallington as a whole. But I now want to move on to talk more about the wider impact of incineration on recycling rates, as we haven't really had the chance to discuss this issue in previous debates. Indeed, the proponents of incinerators often point to recycling as a metric of their success and how they're better than landfill. Now, whilst the latter is certainly true, as landfill is the worst of all options, the same cannot be said for recycling rates. As landfill sites have begun to close and begin to be phased out, incineration has picked up much of that demand, with incineration rates rising nearly 4 times over, from 12% to 44% over the last decade. However, recycling rates have barely moved at all in the last decade, from 37% to 43%, just a 6% increase. Now, this is not coincidental or unrelated. According to very worrying research by the House of Commons Library, the data from the 123 waste authorities shows a general negative relationship between incineration and recycling, aka higher incineration means lower recycling and vice versa. And I've seen this firsthand in Bennington, where I watched as recyclable material was put into the incinerator to be burnt. However, even I did not know how bad the situation was until I read research from Zero Waste Europe, which revealed that more than 90% of materials that end up in incineration plants and landfills could be recycled or composted. More than 90%. Quite apart from the obvious negatives that this brings, burning these valuable materials in order to generate electricity can discourage efforts to preserve resources and create perverse incentives to actually generate more waste to ensure that these energy from waste plants remain economical rather than focusing on prevention and recycling. And again, I've seen this firsthand in Carshalton and Wallington, with residents asking what the point is in separating their rubbish into 4, 5, 6 different bins, only if they get held in the back of the same lorry and end up getting burnt. I've also attempted to have it explained to me about the calorific value of waste and how this waste needs to be burnt in order to generate this so-called energy from waste. This is some kind of perverse metaphor for a diet. Now, leaving aside the problems of energy from waste, which again I know the Minister knows full well about from the discussions we've had about New Mill Quarter in Hackbridge, whose homes are supposed to be heated by this incinerator yet suffer high bills and regular outages. I appreciate that Bays have done a consultation on this and I will be continuing my discussions with them. However, even with turning waste into energy, recycling is still the better option, as it can save up to 5 times the amount of energy that produced by energy from waste, which is not a renewable resource, creates toxic pollution, and emits more CO2 potentially than some hydrocarbon-powered plants. In other words, Mrs McVeigh, incinerators need waste to have an effective business model, whether recyclable or not. That isn't recycling. So this then begs the question, what is the solution? And I want to draw attention to some of the really good work being done by the government on this, and I'm sure the Minister will have more to say on these topics in her reply. The government has, in the Resources and Waste Strategy, set out its ambition to move away from incineration in favour of maximising recycling and indeed a possibility of an incineration tax. The Environment Bill brings in powers to introduce charges on single-use plastics and ban things like plastic straws, stirrers and cotton buds. The Deposit Return Scheme, which has seen recycling rates rocket in over 40 countries, is due to come here to the UK. There's a ban on exports of polluting waste to developing countries, single-use plastic packaging tax, plastic bag charges, carbon capture and storage funding, and indeed that all-important commitment in the resources and waste strategy to moving to a more circular economy. So I do want to congratulate the government for the work that it has done here, but I would urge them to move at pace towards this circular economy. We must look further up the waste hierarchy to achieve this, so I do have a few asks. The next steps up our waste hierarchy are, of course, recycling and reusing waste. We've heard the startling figures already about how much recyclable material ends up in incineration, and this must be stopped. Things such as an all-in deposit return scheme to open up the concept to as many recyclable materials as possible, as well as putting new responsibilities on when it comes to sorting waste to prevent as much of recyclable waste ending up in incinerators as possible, is certainly going to be a good step. Because by removing recyclable and compostable waste from incineration, this will greatly reduce the need for incinerators, helping the government achieve its target of moving away from this form of waste management. But we all know that the very best way is to reduce the amount of waste we produce in the first place. Even better than recycling, as it involves less energy, less extraction of raw materials, and so on. That is why there does need to be a much greater emphasis on reducing production, such as placing responsibilities on producers, incentivising minimal packaging methods, for example, making it easier, and indeed the norm, to choose the more environmentally friendly option, whether that be domestic products such as food packaging, all the way through to heavy industry. Indeed, my new hospital that is being built in the area has a requirement to be carbon neutral, and I really look forward to seeing how they manage to achieve that and the inventive ways they go about doing that. But Mrs McVeigh, it's clear that Carshalton and Wallington has been failed when it comes to this incinerator by a council that is just not willing to act. Incineration may be marginally better than landfill, but it is not the way to boost recycling or create a more circular economy in the long term. We need to look further up that waste hierarchy and do much more to recycle, reuse, and ultimately reduce the amount of waste we produce to help make that need for incinerators, like the one that has caused so many problems for my constituents, obsolete.
The question is that this House has considered waste incineration and recycling rates. And I'm hoping to get to the front bench for about 5:10, which means people have got about 6-7 minutes for their speeches. Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I'd like to thank the member for Carshalton and Wallington for securing this debate. I don't think I've spoken in debate with him before, and it was very interesting to hear about the local government politics of South West London. I have to say, Lib Dem councillors in South West London are no different to Lib Dem councillors in Leeds, and so I have some sympathy for him, and it's a shame none of them were here today to answer for themselves. I'm sure he'll agree with me on that. Although he might not agree with everything I'm going to say. Anyway, so sustainability is one of the biggest and most important challenges facing our country. On a finite planet, we cannot afford to throw a society indefinitely. In the UK, we're consistently missing household recycling targets, and figures shows over 70% of UK packaging waste as either recycled or recovered in 2017 disguise the fact that recovery actually includes incineration. The real recycling rate is closer to 45%. That's compared with 54% in Wales, where Labour are in charge. In fact, Wales is a world leader when it comes to sustainability and recycling, with statutory recycling targets, national recycling campaigns, and most importantly, £1 billion to local authorities since 2000 to help invest in recycling collection services. Wales essentially operates a circular economy, or very close to one, and has constitutionally enshrined rules that promote sustainable development, such as the Future Generations Act. Unfortunately, the picture is quite different in my home city of Leeds, and I frequently receive emails from constituents disappointed by Leeds' lack of curbside glass and Tetra Pak recycling. So I'll tell you, Ms McVeigh, what I tell them, and I'm sure the Minister will want to respond. This is not the product of a lack of political or environmental will from Leeds City Council, where I was actually in charge of this area when I was on the council. It is a result of a lack of funding from central government and a broken system for recycling waste, where the market lords it over the environment. Fortunately, the amount of money needed to change collection vehicles and routes, provide bins and boxes, and other associated costs is not available. And the recycling facilities are not provided by the private sector as a market price for certain renewables are too low. Recycling has been one of the quiet casualties of the austerity programme and an ideology which refuses to fix our broken markets. Local authority cuts and a free market ideology are a huge part of why the national recycling rate has been at a virtual standstill over the last few years. The latest set of cuts to Leeds City Council with 4 million of COVID cost pressures, another 60 million, just the run-of-the-mill government austerity means a ramping up of closure proposals, including Elliot Recycling Centre in Otley, which is only being proposed for closure due to COVID cost pressures. And I hope the Minister can help me in my campaign to save Elliot Recycling Centre in my constituency. But yet recycling rates are soaring during the pandemic. The Local Government Association report that 8 in 10 councils saw an increase in the amount of recycling being collected since the start of lockdown. And some councils, their household recycling increased by 100%. This is positive news, but the government must recognise that this has increased costs for councils and ensure that all the extra cost pressures on waste and recycling services as a result of the pandemic are met, which currently they are not. I'd like to touch on food waste specifically, something we know to be a catastrophic problem, not just in the UK, but worldwide. 1/3 of food produced globally is wasted. In the UK, households waste 4.5 million tonnes of food every year. Supermarkets and other food-adjacent businesses are the main offenders, however, wasting 100,000 tonnes of readily available and edible food each year. That's equivalent to 250 million meals going uneaten in this country. Surplus food should be used to feed people first before it is sent to animal feed or incinerated for energy or sent to anaerobic digesters. There are many fantastic initiatives ensuring just that. I'd like to pay particular tribute to the Real Junk Food Project, which started in Leeds, who I've been working with for nearly 10 years. It's been a pioneering force in the fight against food waste with a core mission of feeding those in food poverty, another issue which has spiked during COVID. We must ensure large stores stop throwing away or destroying unsold food, and supermarkets should donate food waste to charities or food banks that are willing to take food. Again, we can look to Labour and Wales, where household food waste has reduced by 12% to a lower level than the rest of the UK by around 9%. The incineration of waste with energy recovery is slightly preferable to waste being incinerated without any energy recovery or being sent to landfill. But without carbon capture and storage technology, I cannot in good conscience support their construction. And the government are investing in CCS, I admit that. We have no full-scale working models. And without trying to preempt what my honourable neighbour is going to say from Keighley, they're currently having a proposal for a incinerator, which was a campaign that his predecessor started, and I'm sure he's going to touch on in his speech. But he has my sympathy and support, and I think he knows that. We discussed this on the train previously. Waste incineration is usually referred to as energy from waste, but the energy generated, energy from waste plants, currently represents just 1.9% of overall UK electricity production. While electricity and reusable waste heat are clearly valuable byproducts of incineration, they cannot legitimately be claimed as the main purpose of incineration, nor as an economic or sustainability justification for using it as a disposal method. However, there is still no large-scale government funding programme to support the development of anaerobic digestion, which is a solution for much organic waste that local authorities will and do collect. Maybe the Minister could comment on what funding for anaerobic digestion she plans to bring forward. I have to note that today she isn't wearing her leaf suit, which is unfortunate for a debate of this nature, but I know how close these issues are to her heart, and I know that she will want to support more anaerobic digestion. We should also consider the fact that the smelly, loud waste incinerators, which regularly breach pollution guidelines, are 3 times more likely to be built in poor areas than the UK's wealthiest areas. Nearly half the new incinerators are on track to be built in the UK's top 25 most deprived neighbourhoods, with more than 2/3 planned for the northern half of the country. More than 40% of all existing incinerators site in areas more diverse than the local authority average. To conclude, at COP24 3 years ago in Poland, which I attended, Sir David Attenborough warned delegates, "We're facing a man-made disaster of global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilization, extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon." I'm fairly sure the action he had in mind did not consist of building new incinerators up and down this country. We need to come up with more innovative measures, alternative solutions, reducing consumption, boosting recycling, and increasing the proportion of recycled material manufacturing. We need a green industrial revolution and a circular economy. That's the way forward, and I look forward to the Minister outlining how the government is going to achieve that. Thank you.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mrs McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Climate change is one of the biggest threats we face, and so it is right that the government is taking significant action to combat it. As part of this, I welcome many aspects of its approach to waste and recycling, in particular its commitment to creating greater consistency in recycling collections. And one of the examples I can give of that, where it would be useful, is amongst students coming to any town in the country where they're used to one form of recycling, and then they turn up at their university of choice and discover it's a totally different one, and everybody has to be re-educated every year. And we have one very good example of an excellent charity in Loughborough that deals with recycling and reuse, and that's SOFA. They are absolutely superb at keeping out a lot of furniture and household goods out of the recycling chain and sold it on again and reused, which is excellent. There is, however, one aspect of the government's approach to waste and recycling which I think needs to be revised, and I certainly support my good friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, in his comments earlier on. I've made clear in previous debates and correspondence with ministers my concern regarding the building of new incinerators due to the impact they have on the environment and the health of local communities around them. I've pressed for more research to be undertaken to better understand the impact they have on those with higher activity respiratory levels. This is particularly relevant to my constituency, where an incinerator is being built in close proximity to elite athlete training grounds. As the Minister, my honourable friend, the member for Taunton Deane, set out in her response to my recent written question, since the 3rd of December 2019, all incinerator permits have contained lower limits of total particulate matter of 5 milligrams per cubic metre, and that permits issued before this date will be changed to require compliance with this lower limit by the 3rd of December 2023. While this is welcome, and it is very welcome, I would ask that incinerators which have been issued permits but are currently under construction should also have to comply with this lower limit from the outset. I've also been contacted by a local group who are calling for specific PM 2.5 limits to be introduced, rather than just limits for total particulate matter. Further, following the Climate Change Committee's recommendation that all 2020 incinerators should have carbon capture storage, this group would also like it to be a requirement at the point of construction in any planning conditions and including those currently under construction. I would welcome the Minister's comments on these points. It is also the case that we are actively encouraging individuals and companies to recycle more and produce less waste. Over time, we will become less reliant on incinerators, and there will not be enough waste to keep existing incinerators open. In my constituency, there is already not enough commercial and industrial residual waste locally to keep the new incinerator going, and so waste will inevitably be brought in from afar by road, leading to increased vehicle emissions around the M1 and the A512, creating further pollution in our local area from waste produced elsewhere. Finally, I would argue that the incinerators could impact on the government's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 by not encouraging recycling and reuse, and my colleague mentioned that earlier on. If we are to achieve this ambitious target, we must work to reduce emissions from all sources. Thank you.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr McVeigh. It's a great pleasure to serve under my right honourable friend today, and can I commend my honourable friend for securing this important debate and the way he opened it. At the outset, I know the Minister, as we've all spoken on this subject with her over the months and years, will agree with the circular economy and much of what we've said to date, and I look forward to her response. But if I can look at the research done by RAP Cymru in Wales, found that 75% of the ingredients for the incinerators in Wales could have been recycled. And I think we are missing a trick as we look at the incinerators going forward, and especially the development, and I'll touch on that in my constituency in Montgomery in a moment. And equally, if I look to my Celtic cousins in the north and Zero Waste Scotland review, they found that if you were to look at the waste to energy, the only other way of powering energy from waste, the only comparable in terms of the carbon intensity was coal, and we know full well what's happened to coal power stations in this country. So if incinerators follow that, I hope the Minister will look at speed at the waste to energy plans going forward. In my own constituency, there is a development for an incinerator, and I pay tribute to Councillor Amanda Jenner, who's part of our Conservative team. I note the comments about the Lib Dem administrations and Lib Dem councils from across the country, and I share some of the fears you've outlined today about some of their actions. But Councillor Amanda Jenner is leading a campaign to date to make sure that during this pandemic that there is proper consideration of any major planning applications. And I note the concern of the community and the councillors right now that planning application for such a substantial incinerator is being put forward, and the difficult climbs to organise and get community meetings and get the proper planning representations in. But my chief concerns around the incineration, while of course there is a role, at the moment there are of course non-recyclables, that with new technology emerging, landfill of the past was of course awful, and I speak as a massive rural constituency. Landfill is not something we enjoy. However, now we've taken a lot of the organic matter out of landfill, there is a role for looking at the non-recyclables and a way to store them, either, of course, in warehouses, but, of course, in some kind of landfill of the future where you can then mine that resource when you get the technology, of course, to recycle it. So I would welcome very much the Minister's thoughts on looking at the current non-recyclables and a way of storing them for the short period while we invest in technologies to increase our recycle it. And I do pay tribute to lend a non-political angle to much of the Welsh Government's work. As a Welsh Member of Parliament, of course, we work across the parties here on the recycling targets. They are ambitious, they are being met. Our local authority of Powys in Montgomeryshire is doing a terrific job, both through education and the facilitation of recyclables. But it is a great shame when the community sees planning applications for a large incinerator in a very rural area that will require huge HGV movements from across the border, from England and from a large area of Wales. Montgomeryshire is 840 square miles with 50,000 people. That does not lend itself to a huge industrial incinerator on our struggling trunk roads. So the main thrust of my contribution to this excellent debate, and what I will be seeking and looking to the front bench for, is what are the Minister's priorities for looking forward for both waste to energy, but also incineration more broadly, with the investment in the anaerobic digesters. And I do push back a bit because in my constituency in Montgomeryshire, anaerobic digesters are being brought forward by private investors, the agricultural community, especially the poultry farmers. Anaerobic digesters are receiving a lot of private funding. The government doesn't necessarily need to put a lot of money that way, but it does need to look at the regulatory framework and support, non-fiscal support, which I know the Treasury will welcome right now, anything that doesn't require a chequebook. But anaerobic digesters are taking a lot of the organic waste out, so then we can look at the non-recyclables, not necessarily needing to fire, needing to burn them, but looking in the future how we store and then mine them as a resource from the future. But I think, I know there's a time limit, so I shall wind up, but again, to reinforce the front bench that incineration, while it has had a role to date, I would look forward to a way that we can wind it out of our circular economy going forward over the decades. Thank you very much, Ms. McGay.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs McVeigh. And can I thank my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for securing this very important debate. And may I also refer the House to my register of members' interests and declare that my family run and operate a plastic waste recycling business. I want to use my limited time today to talk specifically about waste incineration. touching on my concerns about how decisions regarding new incinerator applications and environmental permitting for waste incinerators are made, and indeed the future direction of waste incineration itself. I'm sure we are all aware of the waste hierarchy. It gives top priority to preventing waste in the first place, and when waste is created, it gives priority to preparing it for reuse, then for recycling, then recovery, and last of all, disposal. The utilisation of landfill, but also waste incineration. And of course, I believe all government policy should be based and worked around with this hierarchy in mind. Now, getting straight to the point, it is my view that there is a strong case to argue that if sufficient weight is given to utilising waste incineration as an option for dealing with waste, then a fiscal disincentivisation, i.e. an incineration tax, should be considered as one of the options, as we have with a landfill tax. And I'd also be favourable to seeing landfill tax increase. Without waste incineration, because without waste incineration, it becomes a barrier to developing a greener circular economy, such as preventing resources from being reused, depressing recycling rates, and of course, as a method, incineration itself gives rise to air pollution concerns. And I want to touch on air pollution. It is quite clear that the process of incineration from waste creates a number of emissions, and there is much concern regarding waste incineration on air quality and human health. This concern relates predominantly to particulate matter. The majority of components which are subjects like sulfate, nitrates, ammonia, sodium chloride and black carbon. Now, the Minister will be aware that back in 2018 and 2019, Public Health England funded a study to examine emissions of particulate matter from incinerators and their impact on human health. The study found that emissions from particulate matter from waste incinerators are low and only make a small contribution to ambient background levels. But whilst levels may be low, the study acknowledged that there is a contribution nevertheless. And these will be factors, and there'll be many factors that influence the impact on air quality and human health the incinerator can have, like the stack height of an incinerator, whether the incinerator is located within the bottom of a valley, and of course the resultant impact of temperature or cloud inversions, and of course the proximity the incinerator has to homes, schools and playing fields. Now, rather frustratingly, and despite huge amounts of local opposition, including from an excellent and well-run campaign group within my constituency, the Air Valley Against Incineration campaign team, along with many residents and myself, and including the Honourable Member for Shipley, my neighbouring constituency, the green light has just been issued for the Air Valley incinerator to operate. This incinerator is to be built on the periphery of Keighley, in the bottom of a valley, in close proximity to schools, playing fields and homes. The scheme was awarded planning consent and given the green light by our local authority, Bradford Council, back in 2016. And just earlier this year was awarded an environmental permit by the Environment Agency. All this despite strong local opposition. Now, residents quite rightly are concerned about air quality, not just from the incinerator itself, but the increased traffic flows bringing waste to the site. And in questioning the decision-making regarding the environmental permit, which has just been issued by the Environment Agency, unbelievably I was told that the Environment Agency could only consider emissions from the incinerator itself and could not consider the emissions from increased traffic flows because that was a planning matter which Bradford Council had already given the green light and considered acceptable in the first place. So this creates a much bigger issue on how the process of permits are awarded for incinerators. And my concern is that there isn't this cohesive, full picture review taken into regard when looking at the impact on air quality from the whole incineration process itself, including the emissions from traffic flow. So for me, This debate is vitally important, and as a member who was able to sit on the Environment Bill Committee, I'm pretty excited about what the government is doing going forward. But I would urge and reaffirm my commitment that all government policy should go back to that first waste hierarchy and really look at adopting a review into whether an incineration tax is the right method to go down, as I believe it should be. So the message from Keighley, Mrs McVeigh, is we do not want this incinerator. It's unfortunate that it looks like the green light has been going, but local voices should be heard much louder and much clearer in any decision-making process when it comes to anything which is likely to have an impact on air quality or human health.
Daniel Zeitner.
Thank you, Mr McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and it's also a pleasure to speak to the opposition this afternoon. I should say at the outset I am a mere stand-in for my departmental colleague and friend, the Honourable Member for Newport West, who is the Shadow Minister for Waste. Because of the travel restrictions, she has to be in Wales, and of course, until we have the motion on Westminster Hall debates later today, there is a requirement that these debates are held in person. I do have to say I do think it's quite extraordinary that we're all being put at risk, including the staff in this place, because, perhaps to use the jargon, it wasn't possible to flex the rules sufficiently. I just hope it can be fed back just how unhappy some of us are about being put in that situation. But more positively, Chair, can I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for calling the debate. I listened with great interest to his account of the difficulties around the Beddington incinerator approved by the Lib Dem-run London Borough of Sutton, and clearly causing a range of problems for him and for his constituents. But the collective task of tackling waste, improving recycling rates and taking the steps needed to protect our environment and preserve our planet is one that we need to do together. It is no secret, I'm afraid, that this side of the House does have concerns as what we see as a lack of ambition on the Treasury bench when it comes to these issues, and the Minister will recognise this as a familiar refrain from our many hours spent on the Environment Bill, where we tried to make constructive and effective suggestions for improvement, but as these things go, they were sadly voted down. But incinerators, as we've heard, emit large quantities of CO2, with roughly 1 tonne of CO2 released for each tonne of waste incinerated. About half of this derives from fossil sources such as plastic, meaning England's incinerators rely on fossil fuels for feedstock, as most plastics are derived from crude oil or natural gas. And I'm told there's currently around 17.2 million tonnes of incineration capacity in England, some 14.6 million of built capacity, 2.6 million under construction. And the waste industry is currently proposing a further 20 million tonnes of capacity for England. But as we've also already heard, existing capacity already exceeds the quantity of genuinely residual combustible waste. So allowing even more incinerators would exacerbate this overcapacity, giving rise to avoidable pollution and expense while harming waste reduction and recycling efforts. So in short, Chair, we should now acknowledge that the time for incineration is over. Indeed, that the age of incinerators should come to an end. Now, once one might have said that incineration was an improvement on the previous practice of landfill, but I no longer feel it's the case, and I note that across England, incineration has increased in inverse proportion to the reduction in landfill in recent years. And I do say to the Minister that an over-reliance on incineration as a means of tackling waste will serve, in the end, no one. That over-reliance means we'll be prevented from moving up the waste hierarchy in dealing with waste generally, and it will stop us looking at waste as a resource that can be recycled and reused, the value unlocked rather than buried or contributing to toxic air. But I also know that a number of my honourable friends around the country have raised concerns about incineration in their communities in recent months. And I'd certainly like to say on behalf of my honourable friend from Cardiff South and Penarth, who wanted to speak in this debate but couldn't be here today, he's asked me to emphasise a point he has made about the need for urgent clarity from the Minister on waste movements around the UK, including between England and Wales. In previous debates, he's made clear his opposition to the incinerator planned by an English company for the east of his constituency, which is currently with the Welsh planning inspectors, but which likely plans to burn commercial waste shipped across the border. I'd also like to mention my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton, who has a particular interest in North London and the impact of incineration on the health and well-being of her constituents. and the member for Bristol North West, who chairs the Bays Select Committee, and who I remember in this very chamber expressing concerns about the planning decisions which he feels don't consider the cumulative impact of multiple sites in close proximity. And similarly, my friend, the member for Washington and Sunderland West, who has an incineration facility at Hillthorne Park in her constituency, and who I know is watching the debate this afternoon. Now, their passion crosses regional and national borders within the UK, and so as we grasp the challenge of reducing our reliance on incinerators, our response does need to be an all-nation response. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could outline what specific discussions she's had with the Environment Minister in the Welsh Government, the Environment Minister in the Northern Ireland Executive, and the Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government on tackling the over-reliance on incineration. Now, over the last 2 decades, the household waste recycling rate in England has increased significantly from just 11.2% to almost 50%, and I'm pleased that half of that time saw a Labour government ambitiously push for a change of behaviour and real action on the green agenda. But I must point out that England still falls short of the EU target of recycling a minimum of 50% of household waste by 2020. And our departure from the EU doesn't mean we should shift gear or slow down. We need to go further and faster. As of 2018, Wales is the only nation in the UK to reach this target. And in 2017, they recorded a recycling rate of 64%, and I pay tribute to the Welsh Labour Government, and particularly to the First Minister and Environment Minister Leslie Griffiths, MS. And I'd also endorse the excellent speech by my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, not only pointing out those successes in Wales, but also for his very important comments on food waste. Now, the Minister will know that England is responsible for the overwhelming majority of waste from households in the UK, and as such it is vital that England, and therefore this government, shows leadership and acts. And if we need further evidence of the need for swift action, we need look no further than DEFRA's own Resources and Waste Strategy Monitoring Report from August last year. It tells us, and I quote, "The large amount of avoidable residual waste and avoidable residual plastic waste generated by household sources each year suggests that there remains substantial opportunity for increased recycling. The message from this assessment is that a substantial quantity of material appears to be going into the residual waste stream, where it could at least have been recycled or dealt with higher up the waste hierarchy." So there it is. We've got to take this seriously, and we've got to take it seriously now. But it isn't just waste here at home, but also the fact that English waste, for want of a better description, has an international impact too. And a written parliamentary question tabled by my honourable friend, the member for Newport West, to DEFRA, question 109651, asked the Secretary of State what discussions he'd had with his Sri Lankan counterpart on the 21 containers of waste returned to the UK from that country in September 2020. And the answer she received from the Minister sitting opposite was revealing. It said that the Environment Agency, as the competent authority for waste shipments for England, is proactively engaging with the authorities in Sri Lanka on these containers and is leading the response on this matter. The 21 containers arrived back in England on Wednesday, 28th October. The containers, which were shipped to Sri Lanka in 2017, were found by Sri Lankan authorities to contain illegal materials described as mattresses and carpets, which have been exported for recycling. With the shipment now back on English soil, Environment Agency enforcement officers will seek to confirm the types of waste shipped, who exported it, and the producer of the waste. Those responsible could face a custodial sentence of up to 2 years, an unlimited fine, and the recovery of money and assets gained through the course of their criminal activity. Well, that answer is telling, because we can't rely on incineration, and we can't simply think we can ship our worries and our waste to shores overseas. The ship that left Britain in 2017 with our waste came back to bite us in September 2020. We simply need to resolve these issues. And it's a topical subject, Chair, because I wonder if the Minister and the honourable gentleman had the opportunity to read a piece in The Guardian this morning over their porridge, because if they didn't, I'd like to let them know that the UK has been accused of failing to honour its promise to, and I quote, curb shipments of plastic waste to developing countries after it emerged that Britain's new post-Brexit regulations are less stringent than those imposed by the EU. And the article notes that from 1st of January, shipments of unsorted plastic waste from the EU to non-OECD countries were banned, but Britain continues to allow it. Continues to allow plastic waste to be exported to developing countries, despite a Conservative Party manifesto commitment banning the practice. And it's important because we're one of the biggest producers of plastic waste in the world, and we expect about 2/3 of it. My honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, put it well, and I quote his response: the government has made big promises to match the high environmental standards from Europe and to ban plastic waste exports. There can be no dither or delay. The British people expect to see these exports banned, more recycling of materials at home, and faster action on the climate crisis. It's up to ministers to deliver on their promises, and fast. But this does not look good. So in conclusion, Ms McVeigh, I'd urge the Minister to think about the social costs of the issues we're discussing, as well as the environmental costs. And it's important to remember the role of local authorities here too, because they're on the front line when it comes to waste collection and recycling. And I urge the Minister to make strongest representations to ministers in the Treasury to ensure that councils have the resources they need. The Minister will recall that until the end of last year, we were covered by the European Waste Incineration Directive, amongst other pieces of waste-related legislation. And can the Minister update the House on what she's doing to ensure there will be no lowering of the standards contained in that directive now the transition has come to an end? And can she also confirm the UK will maintain the EU definition of waste? So in conclusion, Labour is committed to increasing recycling rates and improving the processes around doing so. We recognise the importance of taking people with us and argue that if we don't have buy-in from the public, we're unlikely to achieve the sort of change and progress our planet desperately needs. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for calling this debate. I optimistically encourage him to support our amendments at report stage when our amendments are debated on the Environment Bill, because that's the way we will seize the opportunity to put incineration behind us and move forward to a new world of ambitious and effective recycling, one that recognises and unlocks the value in what was once seen as waste.
Before I call the Minister, I'll remind her that Elliot will need a few minutes for wind-up. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mrs McVeigh. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here in the chair today. And thank you to all honourable friends who have taken part in this debate, which remains a very fiery topic. We've all been here before, and I think it just shows how much interest there is and indeed knowledge on this particular subject. And I'd like to thank in particular, obviously, the honourable friend from Carshalton and Wallington on securing the debates. And I understand that he has particular concerns for his constituents in terms of the energy recovery facility at Beddington, and also particular concerns about the draft South London waste plan, and he spared no punches about his Lib Dem council. I think he's got that firmly on the agenda. Indeed, we had another attack on a Lib Dem council from Leeds North West, although the honourable member has disappeared. But he also raised some concerns about his own council's plans. The local authority for Sutton, in which my honourable friend's constituency is situated, is actually achieving about 49% recycling rate, and it's about the fifth highest of the London boroughs. So they're actually, making quite strides in this particular direction. But whether or not incineration is the agreed method for achieving a lot of that, he raises those important issues. Now, as I said in previous debates, the government's intention remains very firmly on reduce, reuse and recycle, moving the country towards a circular economy. Every honourable friend and member has mentioned this. Even the Shadow Minister and I agree on this, and it was very eloquently put in, particularly by the honourable friend from Montgomeryshire. And actions we're taking will minimise the amount of waste that reaches the lower levels of the waste hierarchy. And this is very, very important. We've heard about that particularly from the honourable friend from Keighley, who uses his own experience actually in the industry, drawing our attention to that particular issue. But this is the intention of the government, and everything in the Environment Bill is moving us in that direction. And evidence of our determination and commitment to limiting the waste that needs to be treated at energy from waste facilities, or landfill for that matter, can be seen quite clearly through our landmark Environment Bill, introduced to Parliament in January 2020. And among other things, it contains broad powers to establish deposit return schemes, such as for drinks containers, extended producer responsibility, and to stipulate a consistent set of materials, including food waste, that must be collected from households and businesses to help make recycling services more consistent. the Government is committed to both improving the quality and increasing the quantity of materials collected for recycling so that we do meet our targets of 65% of municipal waste being recycled by 2035. However, to meet this target, recycling will have to be easier for householders. That was raised in particular by my honourable friend from Loughborough about the students being confused when they go from one area to another, and she's absolutely right, which is why we are making consistent collections law under the Environment Bill. And in these collections, the core set of materials that will need to be collected will be plastic, metal, glass, paper and card, food and garden waste. Food waste was particularly raised, actually, by the Honourable Member for Leeds North West, and it's a shame he's gone because I obviously wanted to highlight that. This is going to be collected. It's absolutely essential. But actually, just interestingly, about just over £6 million is in the process of being awarded or has already been awarded to make sure that food waste at the moment is collected and redistributed by over 300 organisations. It's been really important during this coronavirus pandemic as well, and I wanted to highlight that. And also to say that anaerobic digestion is the preferred treatment for food waste. We're seeking views on this in our consultations and we'll be publishing those shortly. That was raised by the Honourable Member for Keighley as well. Remember, of course, all these things have to be considered with a balanced approach because anaerobic digestion can also produce digestate, and one has to consider what the effect of that's going to be on the environment as well. So all of these options have to be considered in the round. The bill, back to the Environment Bill, though, this will help us drive towards a minimum 70% recycling rate of packaging waste by 2030. And these measures, together with further action on waste prevention, we'll be consulting on very shortly. And it will help us reduce the amount of England's waste that goes to incineration and landfill. And now I hear the concerns raised previously by my honourable friend that having a waste incinerator in the local area can affect recycling rates. Existing permanent conditions, together with new measures we introduced in October 2020, will work to restrict energy from waste plants from accepting material that is suitable for recycling. That is not the intention that it goes to incineration, because we've got this reuse, recycle, longer life, all of those things have to come far before anything ever gets to incineration. And we do need to get higher recycling rates across the board, and local authorities are going to have to take that into account. However, Mrs McVeigh, despite our high ambitions, there will always be waste that can't be recycled or indeed reused. And that's potentially because it's contaminated or because there's no end market. But there are choices around how we manage this unavoidable residual waste, and in making these choices, we need to consider the environmental impact. The legacy of our reliance on landfill is responsible for around 75% of carbon emissions from the waste sector. So it isn't a simple matter of switching back to landfilling of non-recyclable waste. That's why we've been very clear in our resources and waste strategy, which I'm so glad the Shadow Minister has brought to our attention. We've been very clear that we wish to reduce the level of municipal waste sent to landfill to 10% or less by 2035, and why we're actively exploring policy options to work towards eliminating all biodegradable waste to landfill by 2030. Incinerating waste clearly also carries a carbon impact, but the evidence available to us is that for most mixed waste streams commonly sent to energy from waste plants, the carbon impact is lower than if it was sent to landfill. And one of the main issues is, of course, the fossil plastic content in the residual waste stream. Measures we are putting into place will limit the amount of plastic and other recyclables that end up in energy from waste, and this will help to reduce greenhouse gas impacts. But we will continue to consider what else we can do to ensure we remain on our pathway to meet net zero. Government, of course, also wants to drive greater efficiency of energy from waste plants, including through BEIS initiatives to encourage the use of the heat that the plants produce as well as the electricity generated. And in addition, other thermal technologies, which we're following closely, can potentially achieve greater efficiency, reducing environmental impact and delivering outputs beyond electricity generation. But it should also be noted that carbon capture technology could be applied to energy from waste facilities, with the potential to further reduce emissions from this sector. Where applicable, pre-combustion capture technologies may be able to produce low-carbon fuels from our waste, which can be used to decarbonise further sectors of the economy. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan to transform the green economy includes new measures to become a world leader in carbon capture, usage and storage, with an ambition to capture 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year by 2030. That's equivalent of all the emissions from, for example, the industrial Humber today. We've announced an extra £200 million of new funding to create 2 carbon capture clusters by the mid-2020s, with another 2 set to be created by 2030. Air quality has been touched on by a number of honourable friends, and the government is fully committed to reducing air pollution. The World Health Organisation has praised our UK clean air strategy as an example for the rest of the world to follow. I've quoted that many times, Madam Chairman, and we are delivering a £3.8 billion plan to clean up transport and tackle nitrogen dioxide pollution. Rightly, air quality was raised, by a number of friends and members, but we are really getting to grips with tackling this, particularly through the measures in the Environment Bill. So I hope you will agree with me that we are very much driving in that direction. In terms of emissions, the Environment Agency assesses the emissions from new energy from waste plants as part of its permitting process and consults with Public Health England on every application it receives, and the Environment Agency will not issue an environmental permit if the proposed plant will have a significant impact on human health and indeed the environment. And once operational, these plants are closely regulated. I understand that my honourable friend recently called for more air quality monitoring stations to be put in place across his constituency, especially near the Beddington Waste Incinerator, so that residents can access air quality data. But the Environment Agency have said that ambient air monitoring around operating incinerators is not a reliable method of establishing the impact, as it doesn't identify the source of the emissions. We consider it better to use air dispersion modelling to predict the impact based on the highest allowed emissions. And we have audited the modelling, and we are satisfied that it is suitable for assessing the impact from the installation. And honourable members should also note that Public Health England have actually stated that modern, well-run and regulated municipal waste incinerators are not a significant risk to public health. So, winding up, Madam Chairman, I obviously want to congratulate my honourable friend for raising this issue yet again with us. I hope I've assured you that the actions we are already taking will lead to higher levels of recycling and move us to this shift towards the circular economy and away from take, make, use and throw, which everyone has lived with for so long, and it's essential that we do move. Harnessing the energy within residual waste has its place as part of a holistic waste management system, delivering value from resource. I did just want to touch on the tax issue. Should wider policies not deliver government's waste ambitions in the long term, the introduction of a tax on incineration of waste will be considered, taking into account how much a tax would work alongside landfill tax and the possible impacts on local authorities. And similarly, the Shadow Minister knows that we have committed to banning polluting plastic waste to non-OECD countries, and we'll be consulting with all the relevant people in terms of that shortly. So on those grounds, I would like to wind up there, Madam Chairman, leaving the honourable friend to conclude. Elliot.
Mrs McVeigh, and can I thank the Minister for her wrapping up, and indeed I am reassured about what the government is doing on this topic. I think my concern really comes from where my local authority is failing so badly, the residents of Beddington in particular. Can I thank all honourable and right honourable members for attending and taking part in this debate, many of whom have been to many of them before. I think we've raised a lot of really salient points. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I just want to repress that point about the need to look further up the waste hierarchy in terms of dealing with waste in the United Kingdom, to get compostable and recyclable waste out of our incinerators and therefore reduce the need for us to have them. And through our behaviours and policy incentives, we really can move to a place where incinerators become less and less and hopefully not needed at all in the future. Indeed, I do want to very quickly join my honourable friend in welcoming the recycling rates in Sutton. Residents in Sutton are working so hard to do the right thing. It's just a shame that the council isn't backing them to do that. So thank you, everyone, again for attending. And on that basis, Ms McVeigh, I beg to move.
Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.